Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for joining us for the Peace Country Historical Society's presentation. And it's titled Warming Up to the Cold War, the South Peace Experience. I'd like to mention now that we'd appreciate if you'd turn your mics off. We can mute from this end, but just so you're not surprised that you can't be heard. We do this because this presentation will be in two parts. I'm going to lead off and Duff will bring us home, and then we hope to have a question and answer period. So we just thought it might be more efficient use of time. I'd also like to take this time to thank Chris Thompson, our Zoom master tonight, who set up an incredible array of equipment, microphones, cameras, television screens, and really appreciate Chris's work in helping us make this a reality. So I'm going to start, and what I had titled my part of the presentation, The Forgotten Radar Line, and some of you will be familiar with that concept because there was an article in our newsletter a year and a half ago, I can't quite remember, which mentions this to some extent. We've learned a few new things though, and Duff's part will probably be all new to most of you. So I'd like to start by talking about this radar line by giving you some background to begin with. During the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Union and the US and their respective allies were at war. And it was a Cold War, but people were very worried that it was going to heat up, become armed conflict, and that the armament would be nuclear. To detect and defend against a Soviet threat, which we thought then would probably come from the north, the US and Canada agreed to build some radar lines that would give an early warning to such an attack. And on your screen, you'll see what this threat consisted of. Well, I'm going to back up for a minute. The targets were military and installations in cities in southern Canada, and the same in the northern US. That's where the Russians were thought to be wanting to attack, should they do so. So the purpose of the radar lines was to give those places an adequate warning to either launch defensive aircraft or at least try and get out of the way. The threat was this Tupolev bomber. It's a Soviet Russian-built bomber. It's a good airplane, or was a good airplane, and I believe there may be still models in the air.
Still in use.
Yeah, it was long range. It could get here. It was relatively fast for its time and its size. It was capable of carrying nuclear weapons, and a big plus for it was it could utilize an in-flight refueling system. That black thing sticking out of the cockpit is actually a probe, which is part of the fuel system. It went into a hose that was dragged behind an air tanker. So not only could they get here, but more important to the Russian pilots, I'm sure they could probably get home as well if things went well from their point of view. The next slide, I just wanted to indicate our relative position. This is a map of the world, but it's centered on the North Pole. On the right is the Soviet Union, and on the left is North America. And all I'm trying to illustrate here is that you can see it's not that far from here to there, especially if you fly through the Arctic, and that's what was expected to happen. So I mentioned that we'd agreed to build some early warning lines, and here's the three that were eventually built. The first one should be familiar to you. It was called the Pine Tree Line. And please note the dates on the top, and I'm pointing up to the map that you're looking at, just to remind myself to look at it as well. But the dates are, as we progress over time, you'll notice we move farther north away from the US border, and I'll explain that in a minute. But anyway, there was 3 lines built. The first one with the red dots was the Pine Tree Line, and most people here should be familiar with that because of the radar base which was on Saskatoon Mountain for many years. It's the red dot, probably the farthest north one against the western border of the province. The second one, which is more or less the forgotten one, was called the Mid-Canada Line, and it was built along that yellow band, or through that yellow band, which is the 55th parallel of latitude. It was supposed to run from the east coast of Labrador all the way to Prince Rupert, BC, but it actually pretty much stopped being constructed after they hit Dawson Creek. And I'll explain what happened on that one. That's actually the rest of the story. But I will also point out another line, and this may be the most famous one. Many people of our generation, and a few before and a few after, will remember those classic photos. A big white ball dome, radar dome, sitting in the middle of a great big white field with a white polar bear somewhere in the picture. So the Pine Tree Line and the Dew Line, which is that Arctic one, distant early warning, is what it stood for, would be quite well known, but the one in the middle, the yellow band, it was secret when it was built. When it was decommissioned, pretty much it was put to bed entirely. There's very little left of it. And people simply, they weren't reminded every day by driving by Saskatoon Mountain or looking at old geographic magazines to see pictures of the Dew Line. The reason, I'll come back to this for a minute, the reason that the sequence kept moving north, of course, was as bomber technology improved, planes speeded up. And in order to detect the threat to those southern Canadian, northern US places, you had to get your detection system closer to the site that the bombers were being launched from to give, again, adequate warning for them to do something at the target. So the dates on the map, and I hope you did have a chance to look at them, that's why they're sequential. So the Pine Tree Line was built first. The Americans did a lot of it, but Canada was pretty much an equal partner of sorts. They provided funding, they provided personnel, helped operate it, etc., etc. And we felt pretty good about that. It was a joint project and recognized as such. When it came time to build the next one, as people understood the reason why they were going to have to do it, they had to get closer to the Soviet Union and Russia. There was an issue because even while they were thinking about the Mid-Canada Line, it was becoming pretty obvious that eventually they were going to have to go to the Arctic coast, which is about as close as you could get to Russia from Canada. So this gave Canada a problem. They did not have the sufficient funds, they didn't think, in the 50s to be full-blown partners on the Dew Line. It was just going to be too expensive because of the isolation and the transportation costs to get material up there, etc., etc. They were also worried if the Americans went up by themselves, they might influence Canada's sovereignty claim on the Arctic. And that was really important. I mean, there wasn't a huge amount going on in the Arctic, but it was really obvious that that was a place that would be nice to have influence on, and it should be part of this country. That should be our third coast. So it was historically given by the Brits to the fledgling country of Canada, but to hold on to things, you gotta have some presence. Anyway, typical Canadian fashion, they sought a compromise, and what they did was tell the Americans that they would pay for and man in its entirety the Mid-Canada Line, using only Canadian funds and Canadian personnel. And the thinking was, once we do that, we'll be able to tell the Americans, we've done our part. And now it's your turn, and you can carry on and do whatever you wish. And that's exactly what happened. Eventually, I think the Americans built the majority of the DEW line. I'm sure that the Canadians cooperated in any way they could. And it turns out also that the sovereignty at that time, it's different nowadays, but sovereignty claims by Canada just didn't become an issue. I think until the Northwest Passage opened, it probably never would have. So that's the reason for the 3 lines. Now I'm going to focus in on the Mid-Canada line now. As I said before, the route was along the 55th parallel, and in our country, that's about 20 miles into the bush north of La Glace. Okay, that's the 55th parallel. And it would be built from Hopedale in the Atlantic Ocean in Labrador. As I said, supposed to hit the Pacific, never did, stopped in Dawson Creek. The picture that's been up now is it's a heavy lift helicopter, twin rotors, you can see. And this is the way most of the line was built, because you should remember that once you get east of Alberta on the 55th parallel, you're pretty much in the Canadian Shield, and building roads is very difficult. Land access, you may or may not be able to do it. It just seems simpler since we've got these big helicopters. They can fly in all of the equipment that's needed and the personnel. And that's what happened. This was a twin rotor, and it eventually turned into, some of you have heard this name, the Chinook helicopters that the military used for many years. Perhaps they still do, I don't know.
Just brought them back.
Oh, okay. Apparently they were even bought back. But in Alberta, we could build roads, and the specific site we're going to talk about finding north of La Glace had a road built to it. So it was a little bit easier out here. I guess I'll wander on now to what was built. So we have a line, and hang on to, I'll tell you what this was in a minute or two, this picture. What they built along the 55th parallel were 90 non-staffed remote radar stations. These sites were capable of using radar beams and doing it autonomously, but ringing a bell somewhere else, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Chris, if you could slip back to the twin helicopter, I missed something there. It's just the one behind. What I'd like you to look at is what's behind that helicopter. You'll see a mast, a tower, and you'll see some transmitters hung on that tower. And what you'll also see is a wooden shed, at least I think it's wood, just right on the ground of the picture, just a long wooden shed. And I'm going to talk about those because that constitutes what made up every one of these 90 sites. So what they built was a tower, a mast, and they hung radar transmitters on it. They also hung a microwave receiver and transmitter so they could communicate by voice or not email, I'm sure, but whatever other technology was available, teletype perhaps. As well, the on-site was that long building. And on one end of that building, it was about 60 feet long, and on one end, they mounted on concrete foundations 3 diesel-powered generator sets. One was always running to power up the radar and the microwave system. The other 2 were on standby, but could be started remotely from a place I'll speak about in a minute. In the middle of the building, next to the gen set, were all of the fuel, lubrication, and oils that they would need, because the maintenance guys would come in whenever they needed servicing. It was probably monthly or even more often, because these things ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And at the far end of the shed, there was a small bunkhouse that this maintenance crew could live in. I'll talk more about what was found up there when we finally figured out what it was and where it was. But for now, just 90 sites spread across Canada. I could give you an idea of the space distance between them. There's one north of Walhalla. There's very likely one that I can't find somewhere around the Saddle Hills Forestry Tower up north of Spring Lake. The next two to the east were near Flare and near High Prairie. So the other thing that was built were what was called sector control sites. And these were, let me back up a minute. There's a picture of a Sikorsky helicopter on the screen. And this was the helicopter that was used to fly in parts and the maintenance crew that kept all of these sites going. Now, I remember seeing this in the Peace Country as a child. They were very colorful. That's the old RCAF colors. The RCAF flew all of the ones that were in the eastern sector, or the eastern Canada. In Western Canada, there was a BC company called Okanagan Helicopters, and they supplied the pilots to fly these things. What I remember was they were very noisy. That cockpit sits right over top of a jet turbine engine that drives the rotors, but they were quite the rattly machine. Going back to these sector control units, there was 9 of them built, and their function was to receive the radar signals from these remote sites, provide for the maintenance crews a place to live, and then they would go out, and each sector control unit was responsible to look after 10 remote sites. So in our case, that meant that Dawson Creek, which was where our sector control site was, looked after almost all of the remote sites in Alberta. I think the next sector control one was up near Waterways, Fort Mac, somewhere up there. And the sector controls were a bigger thing. They had a infrastructure that included a hangar to house these Sikorsky helicopters, a barracks for personnel, military personnel at least, recreation facilities, cookhouse, dining room, and the communications building, probably the most important building there, because they had to be the ones to hear the alarms go off when something happened. And they were staffed, and you can probably see the military people on the slide as well as the civilians. I think at one time these bases were normally covered about 100 people. Employed about 100 people. There's not that many in that picture, but there is, I think, by my count, a dozen RCAF members. The rest are civies, and of course RCF they're the bosses. They're the ones that are managing this place, but they need all kinds of support: mechanics, cooks, housekeepers, all those kind of things. So 90 remote sites, 9 sector control sites. That's the big layout. In the mid-50s, when this was built, it was, I think it was started in 54. It actually started operating in 58. So maybe it was 56 they started building it, or at least the western half. And it was, in those dollars, mid-50s was $225 million. So it was a big chunk of change. Canadian government and politicians probably had some reason to be concerned. That's actually just over $2 million, $2 billion in today's money. The other thing was, and I mentioned this before, this line was quite secret. There weren't a lot of people around. It was in the bush for the most part, all the way across Canada. So we didn't talk about it much, and again, we weren't reminded about it by seeing much of it at all. Now, the way that the Peace Country Historical Society came to know about this was that Mary Nutting got a letter from a man that lives in southern Alberta now, or central Alberta, but at one time he'd worked in Grande Prairie, and he had a friend in Grande Prairie who had told him, as a young man, he and his brother had taken dirt bikes and gone up into the Saddle Hills just for something to do, and came across a clearing with some odd-shaped concrete blocks on it, a bit of electric wire, maybe even an old radio tube. He couldn't quite remember, but it was obvious that something had been there. So, and that it was north of La Glace. So Mary forwarded the letter to me, just knowing that I like to walk around in the bush, and first thing that came to mind was, well, I'm going to talk to Laverne Sogard. He's Mr. History for the La Glace country, one of our long-term members. And Laverne had actually been there. He and his brother had taken the family grain truck up one day in the summer, I guess, when the road, which had been built in there from the county roads at the end north of Valhalla, and they made it, although he said the road was getting pretty bad even back then. And so kind of knew there was something there, but it was really vague. And I couldn't find anybody else that I talked to that actually, they had ideas, and we investigated TV booster towers, microwave towers, maybe a World War II radio air beacon for the planes that were flying from the States to Alaska and on to Russia, but nothing really fit. It just didn't seem like that was going to work. But eventually, got a hold of some information off the internet. I searched for a bit of time, and Wikipedia, wouldn't you know it, came up with the name Mid-Canada Line, and also supplied a list of GPS points as to where all 90 stations were. So, in checking them out, although the GPS on Wikipedia appear wrong by about 6 miles, and that's likely caused by the fact that the GPS survey system has changed over the years, and the old numbers given they're not that accurate anymore, quite frankly. So, but at least we then knew what it was. We didn't quite know where it was. And I was telling a friend of mine in town that I had this interesting project going on. He was slightly interested in history. I told him what it was, and he started to laugh. He said, "It's your lucky day." I think a friend of mine and I, who liked the quad, were up in that part of the world, and we found a clearing with some funny-shaped concrete blocks, which actually they're not that funny. They're cubes, but as you can see. But at any rate, he had gone in on the old road, but they had quads, and they had a real battle getting in there, alder bushes and beaver dams and you name it. So he pointed out what he thought might be the clearing on a Google map, and a friend and I checked out the maps that are done for the oil patch and found that we could get to a well site only about 2 miles away from that clearing. So that's what we did. We walked in on a snowy fall day, and sure enough, we cut the old road, and you knew it was a road because it had a ditch on each side. That's not something that often happened with winter bush roads. And the last half to quarter mile was straight up a hill, and we're on top of it now, and this is what we found. The blocks that I'm standing in front of are the 3 foundations for the 3 gensets, diesel powered. Not only were they strong enough and have bolts sticking out of them that would have bolted the genset down, but there's diesel fuel stains on them to this day. They haven't bleached away completely. The next picture is a picture of a piece of concrete standing up the other way, and we think, because it had bolts sticking out the top, this is a anchor point for the guy wires for the mast. We never did find the foundation of the mast. It might have been ripped up during decommissioning. So we also found the outline of the foundation for that 60-foot shed. And sure enough, on the other end, where I said the bunkhouse, it was only a few steps from there to the privy. The privy's a hole, it's still cribbed, but we didn't poke around too much and look at it. Just knew it was there. We also found a pipe cut off at ground level that we think might have been a well. So now we knew what it was, and we actually had an idea where at least one of the remote sites could be found. It kind of verified the whole thing. So the following week, we went up to Dawson Creek, and just looking around, it was pretty obvious where it must have been, because it was an aircraft hangar, and in the middle of town. It's now called the Northern Lights College. If you go into Dawson Creek and go around the Walmart corner to head north, you'll see a big cement tower off to your right. It's at one edge of the Northern Lights College campus. So we drove in, and sure enough, the aircraft mechanic because I went to the hangar to begin with, and he pretty much had the history of this place. He said, yeah, this is the old sector control station. This is the exterior of what was the hangar for housing those Sikorskys. And I'll flip the next picture. This is the interior. And I can't remember which end, but he told us that the hangar had been extended by the Northern Lights College because this is the space they used to teach new aircraft mechanics in. And you notice the difference in construction on that far wall. The old hangar was either the south half of that or the north half. I can't remember what he told me. I suspect it might have been the north half, and it was built out to those big doors to the south. So at any rate, he said, yeah, this was the hangar. In addition, there was an administration, or the administration building is now in the old building that was used as the communications center. And the barracks are student residences, and there's a few other buildings that are used for storage and stuff like that. So we pretty much had the complete story. But I have skipped over a part, and this is kind of fun. I forgot to tell you how this radar system worked, because it's a bit different. The radar system it's called a Doppler system, and another name for it was the McGill fence, because McGill University in Montreal is where the technology was developed. And if you can picture the antennas pointing straight up in the air, okay, and they project a radar signal 65,000 feet up. That was beyond the capability of any aircraft back then. So if you're going to fly this way, you had to go through the fence. If you went through the fence, it acted like a trip wire, and a big alarm rang in Dawson Creek, or whichever the sector control center you were at. And then they would figure out what to do next. The issue with the McGill fence is you can't tell what flew through. You can only know where it flew through and probably what elevation. But it could be a Piper Cub, or it could be one of those Tuplos. So you obviously then you lean on the pine tree line probably to determine what that was. But at least they knew earlier than the pine tree line that something was coming. So I'll just wrap up now. The Mid-Canada line became obsolete in it was shut down in 1964. Again, for that sequencing reason, the DEW line was built and running, and there was no more need for it. So with the remote sites, they just dismantled them. Sometimes they buried stuff, sometimes they hauled it away to use, but there's very little left, and the forest is growing back up. The sector control sites, they tried to find community uses for them, as in the Northern Lights College. I have a friend that used to be the school principal in a place called Cranberry Portage in Manitoba, north of the Paw. He remembers being the principal of a school that was in the recreation facilities on their sector control. And with that, I think I've used my time, so I'm going to turn this over now to Duff for the second half of the presentation. If you have questions, glad to try and answer them at the end of his presentation. Thanks.
So my section I'm calling the Planning to Survive, the civil defense aspect of this, and tying it together with what Pat said. Pat's work pioneers locating the remains of the most secretive part of our Cold War air defense. It's no coincidence that it was very carefully concealed and torn down so that nothing would remain. In the same way that the Avro Arrow was literally destroyed, the 6 surviving aircraft, so that no part of it could be seized and reverse engineered by a hostile power. I think the big concern was that both China and the United States worried about the Arrow because it could fly high enough to catch the U-2, the American spy plane. we were front line in the Cold War. We were part of the frontline location in defense of North America against Russian bombers. In fact, we were part of the air front in defense of North America. And what about Grande Prairie itself? You know, we talk about the Beaver Lodge pine tree site, but what about the city itself? How was the South Peace preparing for nuclear attack? How did we fit into the big picture of civil defense for Alberta and Canada? What were we supposed to be prepared to do on the day or the day after? It's no coincidence that the Premier of Alberta, E.C. Manning, was already alarmed and raising questions with various business councils in Edmonton and Calgary because he had been informed that Alberta was literally on the flyway for Russian bombers to achieve the heartland of America. And that meant that potentially air battles would be occurring right over us in the defense of the American frontier as well. He wanted to know what was being done. So Grande Prairie was on the map actually right from the end of World War II. We connected with the Alaska Highway, which was the direct access to Alaska from Central North America. And of course that road could be run both ways. It could also be the access for a Russian land force to enter into northern Canada. And it also had railway links. Grande Prairie had railway links to Edmonton and air links as well. So as being on the doorway of the Northern Defense Zone, it became important for the Army to demonstrate to the U.S. that the Canadian Army was capable of operating in our own Arctic. And so in 1946, Operation Muskox was created. You'll see from the map, it began on the shores of Hudson's Bay, led driving north into the far Arctic, across the islands and over the ice, and then down, eventually down the Alaska Highway to Dawson Creek, and then from Dawson Creek to Grande Prairie. And from there, the vehicles, which were called Penguins, and there's one of those little cute fellas right there, were designed to be brought back by train to Edmonton. But in the way of doing that, they were delivered by glider and by air to Hudson's Bay and serviced from there by air, demonstrating that the Canadian Air Force and the Army was capable of running operations in the Arctic in 1946, just in case. The irony, of course, was the Penguins had been designed in World War II for operations in Norway and just happened to be lying around. They had a problem, though. You had to drive with the window open because of carbon monoxide building up from the engine. And so a lot of hard experience was earned in getting this force all the way from Hudson's Bay to Grande Prairie. But it meant that it even makes one of the pictures on our walking tour of Grande Prairie, because as the Penguins came through, every small boy with a sense of adventure and a bicycle followed the convoy through town. It did cost one life. One of the Inuit in the north who was helping actually drowned when one of the Penguins went through the ice. But generally it demonstrated that we had the technical skills to operate as an army in the north, even though the exercise was never repeated. Now, along with this, we had a militia organization in Grande Prairie, D Company, which was a recruiting basin for the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, or the 49th Battalion as it had been known in the First World War in Edmonton. And so there was awareness here. In fact, there were guest speakers, one of them a former military general, General Burns, who came to Grande Prairie and rocked a Chamber of Commerce meeting by saying confidently there would be a war with China in the near future. And therefore, this meant that our militia company had some awareness and some visibility. We put a lot of demonstrations and exercises showing what could be done. And every soldier that went from Grande Prairie into military service was featured with a photo spread in the Herald Tribune. At one time, there was an attempt to demonstrate the engineers from Edmonton who brought up a Bailey Bridge, one of the famous World War II heavy bridges that was used overseas, and demonstrated how quickly they could throw it across a creek in the event of needing to operate or conduct rescue operations in the northern area. All of this was promoting military awareness on the ground, but what about the air? Though the RCF recruited in Grande Prairie and in the Herald Tribune, and we had air cadets both in Sexsmith and in Grande Prairie and eventually across the north. They drilled, they exercised, they did aircraft identification. Nevertheless, the challenge was, how do we support the aviation defense of the region? Now, of course, the airport supported flights, back and forth, and if a fighter plane going north ran into difficulty over the swamps in Muskeg, Grande Prairie became a rescue center to find them. At one point, an F-86 Sabre was lost on the way south, and a base there and air communication with Dawson Creek was necessary to find this fellow and bring him out. But most of the action seemed to be further north. Cutting out our own frontline fighters and replacing them with American missiles. But if you look at this map, this is a secret map of the B-39. These were the giant super bombers that for 10 years carried the big bombs north and south. The flyway to their marshalling point in Alaska was right over Grande Prairie. And it shows the way in which the air front included the aviation space both ways, just as easily as American bombers could fly from Rapid City north over us on the way to Alaska, so Russian bombers could come that route as well and have the Alaska Highway as a landing zone if they ran into difficulty. But at the same way, straight across the north, they could be over Alberta and into the American heartland, heading towards Strategic Air Command headquarters by the most direct route. Our airspace over Alberta was potentially the highway of, if not nuclear holocaust, perhaps airborne attacks to take out radar and radio stations, and as a preliminary to even perhaps an invasion or a military incursion. It really was clear, judging by this American map, and also the Northwest Staging Route airfields, that we were potentially vulnerable. Any Russian bomber attacking the American West had to fly those routes, and as a result, Manning was very concerned that the oil refineries in Edmonton and the Alaska Highway and the major cities of Edmonton and Calgary in the south were potentially targets with a large, heavy population who could be damaged, if not by the devastation of the atomic bombs in those early days, by the fallout that came later. And certainly with the coming of the thermonuclear bomb, 10 to 100 times more powerful than a simple atomic bomb, the real fear was fallout. The drifting radioactive particles that could be raised up in the sky, poisoning the land, poisoning the air, and poisoning the people for decades potentially downwind of where these bombs landed. So clearly in Alberta, it was the air front rather than the land front that would preoccupy our planners. So as we found, there are military defense plans. Here we see the Pine Tree Line, and carefully concealed here some of the Mid-Canada line. What you also see are airfields at Central Alberta Penhold, built as a training field, but later upgraded as a fighter base. And for many years, we had CF-100 fighters there to complement the flights that might come up from the United States. The U.S. offered us supersonic fighter bombers, often with nuclear missile-tipped missiles, anti-aircraft missiles. They would sterilize several cubic air miles in space, airspace, and hopefully take out a whole squadron of Russian bombers if they were close enough, with very little discussion of the consequences for the Albertans living underneath this kind of interception. But nevertheless, that kind of discussion was given, and essentially the idea was that from Penhold, RCF-100s, which were all-weather fighters, could fly an interception and attack with their own missiles. But in the meantime, the big heavy guns would be the American supersonic planes coming up from the northern U.S. Air Force bases. There's our CF-100s on the top. They had machine guns on the bottom because the missiles that they fired from their wing pods proved to be rather unreliable. They were famous for short circuits and firing off unpredictably whenever they felt like it, in the air or even on the ground. I've had a wonderful story from one Air Force pilot about one of these rocket pods going off on the ground and blowing a hangar door off one of the hangars at Penhold. Another one, both rockets went off on each side and managed to straddle a squadron commander who was taxiing out front at the time, to which he replied on his radio, "Missed." Below them, however, was the Voodoo, CF-101. The American Voodoos were designed first. Initially, they had no guns. Their only weaponry was to fly at 2 to 3 times the speed of sound on a 2-minute scramble or a 5-minute scramble and fire the nuclear-tipped Genie missile, which would go out and, as I said, sterilize several cubic miles of airspace stopping squadrons they hoped of Russian bombers. It's interesting that Alberta got the CF-100s with what were called the Mickey Mouse rockets. They were so unpredictable that occasionally one would go sideways and hit the canopy of the pilot who was flying the plane. That's why the machine guns eventually were installed. But the CF-101 Voodoos, the super high performance ones, were shipped to the Atlantic at Chatham Air Force Base and Goose Bay and were used to protect the Atlantic side, not the central or western side. This, of course, led to Vancouver complaining about what would happen if we had a nuclear war at Pearl Harbor, to which Ottawa basically said, well, you're on your own if that takes place. So there was a lot of politics about that as well. The funny part is, of course, that this is the jet age, and it depends on radar stations like the Mid-Canada or the Pine Tree to actually direct the fighters to find the Russian bombers. It was much like the Battle of Britain. A plane breaks the fence, the Pine Tree would identify, or the ground observers who were in the area would get their binoculars out and begin to help identify the aircraft. But it was the Pine Tree line at Beaver Lodge that would give the height and the direction and potentially the speed of the aircraft that was approaching, which meant, as one of our members, David Leonard, has said, that at one point they used the local air observers to calibrate and test the radar. Air cadets, for example, might notice an aircraft flying over Sexsmith or Grande Prairie, and they would be asked to phone that in, giving the height, potentially the type of aircraft and the direction, and then they would get a serious response on the switchboard from Beaver Lodge, thank you very much, that checks out, or that they would look in to see if it did check out, to involve people in the air observation defense of this area as well. It's interesting too that Beaver Lodge was a fairly significant base because it actually had 3 radar installations. The main one, the big station with the big dome, but 2 smaller ones, and about a mile away a transmitter, which was actually where the directions to the fighter planes would be given from. So that if for some reason the radar domes were taken out by an attacking force, the last radio directions to the intercepting fighters could still be transmitted. The domes were quite impressive. And the garrison could be quite large. They were built initially by the U.S. Air Force. Here is one of their homegrown guides so that people would know how to find Grande Prairie and what to find in it when they came in from Beaver Lodge, which must have seemed to some of them like the end of the earth. But on the other hand, at least it wasn't Alaska. And then, of course, by checking with the ground observers and the aviation radars, they could begin to vector, as they say, or direct the fighters in to make interceptions. And the advantage of the CF-100 was that it was all weather. The co-pilot or the radar operator sat in the back like the Rio did in the later fighters in the U.S. Navy, and on his radar could direct the fighter after he was brought into the general area by the ground control radar, some of which was operated actually from North Bay, from the underground bunker there. Now in 1963, the base was handed over to the Royal Canadian Air Force as Canada's share of the air defense. The U.S. Air Force packed up and left, handed it over to us, especially as, since the Arrow was not going to be used after all, Canada's way of contributing to the defense of North America by air would be taken up by manning the radar bases and putting these Voodoo superfast aircraft in the Maritimes. Penhall continued to operate the CF-100 for a number of years, while the U.S. Air Force backed it up with their supersonic fighters south of the border. Of course, what this meant was that the air battle to intercept the Russian bombers would take place over anywhere south of Grande Prairie and north of Calgary, and which meant that potentially broken Russian bombers, pieces of bombs, undetonated nuclear warheads might come raining down along with pieces of fighter in that terrible, furious air battle which might take place, which very few people wanted to really contemplate. The irony, of course, was that at one point, if the fighters ran out of missiles and bullets, they were instructed to ram the Russian bombers with their own aircraft. In 1964, the radar at Beaver Lodge was automated and calibrated for long-distance early warning, focusing on detection rather than fighter interception. The interesting thing, of course, is the contribution that the base made. By the way, the two radars, the one on the center is the one for direction and altitude. The altitude is the one on the right, the kind of lozenge-shaped radar antenna on the right. That would give you the height. The other would give you the direction and the speed, hopefully, of the transgressing aircraft. Now, this is interesting. This is an interior of one of the pine tree stations on the left. What's interesting is if you look at the uniforms, these are all Canadian airborne soldiers who have been brought up to plan the defense of the pine tree stations in the event of Russian airborne inserted saboteurs or local saboteurs. And there was some training. The Airborne Edmonton base did send up some soldiers to do some war games around some of these places, but I can't confirm that it happened at Beaver Lodge. But as you'll see, they managed to publicize some of this to reassure the public that the stations would always be protected by our Army as well. The Herald Tribune also records a number of weddings. One of the biggest impacts of the Cold War was a number of American airmen who married local girls and took them south with them. And so what we actually saw was something of a young female drain on the Beaver Lodge area by these bright, sharp, well-trained, well-educated, more affluent and living in the south airmen that took them with them on the way down. They also contributed a fire truck to Beaver Lodge, and in that sense became part of the community. The Beaver Lodge State Base also hosted and supported the Air Cadets. They provided a vehicle, actually, which brought Beaver Lodge cadets into the Grande Prairie Squadron as the years went by, too. Local contractors, of course, benefited, and the Herald Tribune was quick to point that out, that there was an economic contribution being made to support the Beaver Lodge station. But as I said, the only concern was sabotage, and so we have some photographs of the airborne up here doing some maneuvers. But the real danger, as you can see on the right, was budget cuts. Eventually, the station was demolished. I remember it standing when I came up here in 91 or 92, but by 93 it was gone. Its only threat was obsolescence and expense. And so eventually nothing is left now. Even though a discussion was hoped to take it and preserve it as some kind of a museum, it had too much asbestos in it for the armed forces to allow it to stand. So it was taken down and eventually removed from the top of Saskatoon Mountain. Meanwhile, in Grande Prairie, attention was focused from time to time, it has to be admitted, on civil defense. Grande Prairie was not considered a target for a nuclear bomb, although there was discussion of incendiaries being targeted on the Beaver Lodge station and perhaps collaterally on Beaver Lodge and Grande Prairie by Russian bombers to neutralize their effectiveness. Grande Prairie was not considered a viable atomic target. And even Beaver Lodge was excluded, rather optimistically, from being a target of attack. The real concern was nuclear fallout. The invisible killer that could poison generations if not sheltered from the downwind radiation cloud. It's interesting that in 1959, the Diefenbaker government took more time and paid more attention and invested more money in fallout defense than any other government of the time, then or after, even though it was the Pearson government in '65 that accepted nuclear warheads and gave us our own nuclear deterrent. It was the Diefenbaker government that put the money into what's called emergency measures organizations involving nuclear war. So while engineers calculated the blast done by damage, these are circles designed for atomic bombs, not thermonuclear hydrogen bombs. So you can see that the blast zone is about 5 miles altogether in diameter from ground zero. And that meant that potentially a city the size of Edmonton could have a bomb on an atomic bomb, and large parts of its outskirts could survive. Although again, the problem would be the civil defense issues that occurred in World War II, firefighting, collapsed buildings, wounds, burns, and so on. But the theory was that volunteers could be organized to do that kind of civil defense. The problem was that certain structures could hold up better than others, and actually there was a little calculator that civil defense people could carry around. I have it at home somewhere, but I can't find it, about the size of a protractor, and you could use it as an engineer if you were level-headed enough after an atomic attack to calculate the type of damage and the casualties correlated to the type of building. It looked kind of like that round calculator computer that pilots used to carry. And as a result, it was meant to be operated the same way. Although, as some commentators said, the idea of a local civilian engineer being able to sit down level-headed after a nuclear attack and be able to do the calculations was perhaps a bit optimistic. For those outside the death zone, Canadian leaders offered this comfort, paralleled by the Civil Defense Agency of the U.S. These are just for old-fashioned atomic bombs. Thermonuclear bombers were already being developed, which offered 10 to 20 times the destruction, but they would not be considered for the peace. The peace would never be a target of a thermonuclear bomb. They were reserved for Edmonton and Calgary. Survivors might come north if they could make it north and trickle into the peace country, in which case civil defense was supposed to provide housing, first aid, and shelter for them. But the real concern, there's the calculator in that previous slide, or the next one perhaps. Yeah, it's a little green fella. There it is. That's the calculator that came with the book, The Effect of Nuclear Weapons, which I used to have a copy of. And this is the other picture we have of an operation called Lifesaver. This was done out of Calgary because the theory was that the only way to defend these cities from thermonuclear weapons was not to be in them when they went off. And so there was a lot of effort put in by civil defense and later emergency measure people to calculate and regulate and schedule how, given a certain number of hours warning, which was the assumption that an attack would not come out of the blue, pardon the pun, and there would be at least 3 hours warning by the pine tree picking up bombers coming south, that a large part of the population, if they were properly coordinated, could be evacuated from Edmonton and Calgary. This is Operation Lifesaver, which was an attempt with Calgary. The problem was the day they scheduled to do it, and they put months of planning into it. They had up to 40,000 people on the schedule, prepared to use their own vehicles because there weren't going to be enough buses. There was only one train line and only one paved highway, the Trans-Canada. That everyone would jump in their cars from the north end of Calgary and head out to Airdrie and other sites, Clare's home, and east to Three Hills. This was all going to be coordinated to happen on a 3-hour warning. Problem was, a lot of people didn't hear the warning sirens. There was always a problem with the air raid sirens not being heard clearly, and there was an 18-centimeter snowstorm that day, followed by a Chinook, which rendered all the unpaved roads in the Calgary district impassable mud. As a result, the exercise was postponed for a week, which pretty much killed the organization because 3/4 of the people scheduled for it went on with their lives and did other things. So that in the end, when it occurred, Lifesaver only evacuated about 18,000 people in the 3-hour time limit that was prepared, and the rest would have been, I guess, more or less obliviously incinerated in the bomb hitting Calgary. But the rest would be sheltered. Church basements were opened. There were cookouts. It almost had the atmosphere of a fair, said civil defense observers, because people just couldn't take it seriously. It seemed so unthinkable. And in fact, in the south of Alberta and all across southern Canada, the biggest barrier to civil defense was the simple psychological unbearableness of it. People could not conceive of it taking place. Although there was heavy effort, great effort put in to encourage Canadians to build their own personal bomb shelters. And that brings us back to Grande Prairie. Let's go back to that map, Chris, of the personal bomb shelter. This was the plan. You'll notice, by the way, the center one features a subdivision called Regency Acres. This was the only contractor who guaranteed to build you a bomb shelter under your new home. And as you can see, it had all the features, especially the cinder block construction with the holes in the center of the cinder block filled with cement. And that's a giveaway. If you have a building from the 50s with cinder block construction and the holes in the middle filled with concrete, and the roof or the ceiling being heavily reinforced, not always with concrete, but with heavy planking. This was a giveaway that you had a home with a bomb shelter in the basement. The planking, the sandbags, all of that was to dampen the radiation, and then the cinder blocks were considered to have less radiation through. You were supposed to stuff them full of supplies to last at least 3 weeks, but in principle 3 months in case the radiation was super intense. And then you would be equipped with your own transistor radio, because telephone lines would be down. Canada never achieved the armoring of their telephone lines, and it was pretty much assumed that all the telephone lines and the switchboards and the switchboard operators would be obliterated by the nuclear attack, or die of fallout if they stayed in their switchboards, at their switchboards. So transistor radio was meant to be the way to communicate, and that meant that when Grande Prairie had its own shelter in the old town hall, it had a couple of radiation detectors, probably a lot of maps, and of course a radio, probably some linkages, we think, to ham radios as well. There probably was a shortwave in the bunker as well. But the Grande Prairie shelter was considered a medium-sized shelter. The ideal ones were the family size. But in fact, about 2,000 Canadians built personal, private air raid shelters. In fact, I found one in Ottawa. One of my friends had bought a house in Alta Vista. If you know Ottawa, it's about 5 miles from the Parliament buildings. So it was actually built to survive an atomic attack, not a thermonuclear. And I went down and had a look at the way it was built, and I could see all the hallmarks of a bomb shelter. So I reassured my friend that if she was ever attacked by atomic bombs, the basement would be a reasonably safe place to go, at least for a little while. But she would have to prepare it pretty heavily. And if there was a thermonuclear attack on Ottawa, well, it would make it nice too. Seriously, the result then was, could Canadians take this seriously? And the answer was, in the peace country, which was at 55 degrees, there was enough distance from the target zones that a serious attempt was made to organize. And so after that, we actually had people beginning in 58 to do some civil defense planning in Grande Prairie. Isabel Campbell of the Herald Tribune reassured readers that the measures were planned for natural disasters, not nuclear, and that Mr. Bairstow and Mr. Borstadt and Fire Chief Pete Eager were actually helping to coordinate city officials to plan for a natural disaster. Nevertheless, the point was made that this would also be useful for nuclear disaster, linking ham radio operators and others working out of the bomb shelter in City Hall, and it should be added, at the D Company Armory. These plans may still survive in the city archives, but I have not been able to dig them up yet. I'm still looking for some of this material. So it might be interesting to see if some of these plans are still here, as well as mobilizing air cadet, forestry, plane spotters, and by the way, elevator managers who had to be bonded and were considered solid, upstanding citizens who were given aircraft recognition charts, and I think binoculars as well, so that they too could be in on the aircraft identification of any transgressions of our airspace. The actual shelters were built to provide with radiation detectors. The government ones, which were built, about 1,200 in Canada, Grande Prairie's being one of them, would have been provided with 2 types of radiation detectors. The biggest one, the 1505 type, the pink one on the right, was the best and could be operated from inside the shelter, but it was never issued to Canadians. It never got to Canada. They were bought in the States and never were delivered. So instead, Canadian operators got the little black fellow there in the middle, a handheld radiation detector, which the operator was supposed to wear protective clothing, step outside of the shelter every hour, take a reading, and then go inside and get on their radio, or if they were lucky, telephone, and phone the reading to the central station in Penhold, Alberta. The site, by the way, was known as Bridge 2. They would contact Bridge 2 and give a reading. And this would give the government of Alberta a chance to more or less decide over the many different stations, they're about 50 miles apart, which areas had the least amount of radiation, and they could direct survivors to move there with their private vehicles. This is pretty ad hoc, and it pretty much guaranteed that the operator would contaminate their own shelter with radiation coming in on their clothing. But nevertheless, the plan was there to try that, to give some readings. And these were handed out, although they were all taken back in 1967 by the Army. Railway companies were supposed to use their stations Police stations were supposed to build a shelter underneath them. Most of these were never built because the different agencies that were supposed to host them didn't want the disruption and didn't want the expense. And by the way, if you built your own private shelter, there was a good possibility your municipal taxes would go up for a home improvement. This discouraged quite a bit of participation, especially because a shelter cost $500, which was at least 10 to 20% of an average Canadian's total income in the early 1950s. The result then was there was an air of futility, but also goodwill in the Peace Country. The headquarters was in City Hall, as I said, and in 1962 we actually had a civil defense crew. We had 11 volunteers, some of them here photographed. This picture was provided by Harry Laners, who was one of the members of that crew. As you can see, they're equipped basically for World War II, not for nuclear war. But again, the assumption was that probably up here, any attack would be limited, very limited, and more work would be necessary, perhaps doing a little bit of rescue work and firefighting, but primarily the kind of light construction or light rescue work that would be done in an atomic attack, not a thermonuclear. The next one shows their equipment. Besides the radiation detector, they had one wrecking vehicle which could be used to pull down wreckage, remove stuff from buildings, or tow vehicles out of the way. By the way, if you know of any of these people, other than Mr. Laners, who is in this photograph in the back row, if any of you happen to know or are related to members of the Civil Defense of 1962 or have any information, we at the Historical Society would love to know, both to identify and also to perhaps interview or discover more information, because it's a bit of a mystery how the work was done. But given the level of equipment, most of the work was meant to be for more natural disasters than thermonuclear anyway. There was one mock attack conducted, and poor old Hines Creek was selected as the site where the bomb would drop. An atomic bomb would drop on Hines Creek as the unlucky target, and the exercise was done on paper with coordination from D Company Armory and the bomb shelter. RAF veteran E.M. Dunbar, who had lived in Beaver Lodge by then, was the permanent civil defense coordinator here and was in charge of that operation along with city officials. So while the government, gave lots of reassurance, it's interesting that on one map donated by Mr. Laners, there are two prospective fallout clouds written on the map, both of which are pretty alarming. They come out basically beginning at a ground zero near Beaver Lodge, but notice the fallout clouds drift very far east with the prevailing winds. In fact, the longest one goes as far as Smith, which indicates that this sort of rain of death dust would travel as far east as Smith if the wind was right, and if there was less wind, it might simply spread a bit more to the north and south. But either way, even though technically there was not supposed to be any major threat, if you look at this map, which Mr. Laners provided me before his death, you can see, in fact, that they were trying to keep all possibilities open. Although how, again, you could manage to defend against it if your radiation detector required the operator to leave the shelter to use and everyone else was trying to stay indoors, it'd be very hard to organize that. However, the Hines Creek drill went ahead and, of course, was declared a success, but I have no idea how entirely it was conducted. In hindsight, it must have been difficult to imagine Grande Prairie not panicking over a nuclear attack if there was a flood of refugees trickling up to the north from a nuclear disaster in the south, such as Edmonton. Although the distance and the 200 miles of muskeg might be a natural barrier to large crowds of wounded or damaged or burned or traumatized refugees coming north, it would be interesting to know if the Peace Country was prepared or could have been prepared to take and house and shelter for as long as 6 months such refugees. And my last point, it would be to make a discussion that I had on an aircraft with a person who worked in Ottawa, that at one point there was discussion of the Peace Country being a last refuge for Canada. The Peace Country was isolated, as I just said. It had good water supply, road connection to Alaska, airfields, and good agricultural land from which they hoped that region could feed itself. And so, although it never became concrete planning, there was discussion of a last refuge of Canada, or at least Alberta, being designed to be centered on the Peace Country, where the government that survived and other officials could begin the reconstruction of home. So, what we have then is the mystery of what it was all meant to do. If there was any central plan, we don't have any evidence of it. Maybe in some of the city records, perhaps. The city hall, the old city hall that had the bomb shelter, was torn down. I have no photographs to tell how it was constructed, and I haven't met any witnesses who actually ever operated in there, although I've heard it, it housed various things from bats to other things being stored there. And we do know that in 1967, any electronic equipment was literally removed by the Army and taken away, effectively disabling it for anything but telephone connections and map exercises. What we do have, though, is for a few years, there was this time, and we still have echoes of it and some remnants, as Pat shows, when one can still see the mysterious concrete foundations, the bits of gadgetry, the insignia. Sometimes you might find quaint but alarming pamphlets in your home collection of stuff, prepared for us in peacetime, as if for another day, an almost forgotten era, when some of us lay awake at night closely monitoring the daily news on the radio, keeping the radio on, keeping their coveralls and their first aid kits ready, just in case the world as we knew it might start to disappear forever.
With that, I'll ask Chris to say goodnight for us.